As I was preparing for this talk, I happened to be reading Wendell Berry's The Mad Farmer poems. Jack Williams, not Pennsylvania's own Jack, but the science team Jack Williams, introduced me to Wendell Berry's writing years ago, and I came across this passage in his author's note that I want to share with you. He says, the joke of the Mad Farmer poems is that in a society gone insane with industrial greed and insecurity, a man exuberantly sane will appear to be mad. These poems embody a vision of sanity breaking forth into a world driven crazy by dreams of wealth, power, and ease, and so by fear. And it struck me that your passion for our work is a perfect demonstration of exuberant sanity. And your commitment to conservation is a great example of a vision of sanity breaking forth. And so with apologies to Wendell Berry, I'm going to use the Mad Farmer as my guide for this presentation today. But first, I want to share with you just a little video here.
It's a necessary investment, I think, to be a life member.
Joining Trout Unlimited was the best way I knew of to guarantee that when one of us puts a fly rod into the hand of the next generation or the generation after that, the trout will still be there waiting for them.
I certainly hope that in 20 years, the efforts that TU and other conservation organizations are making now are going to result in at least improved fisheries in some areas and survival of fisheries that we might have otherwise lost.
I don't live anywhere near a trout stream. This is my home water, the LA River. Isn't she majestic?
You go past the signs that say, you know, this area was held protected by Trout Unlimited. That's the reason why I felt that I needed to be part of this. It's something that I hold dear to my heart, and to have a group of people back something that you just hold, you know, ethically sound, it's a no-brainer. Becoming a life member was easy for me because it truly is part of my life.
Getting the fish into the net apparently that's up to me. I thought there was a clause that you would get unlimited fish every time because that was the name. I was misinformed. But still, I'm very happy for my membership.
I mean, last year we had Hugh Jackman on the David Letterman show talking about Trout Unlimited, and now we have Timothy Amundsen doing the same, talking about life membership programs. So I typically begin this presentation with the next two slides that I'm going to share with you. The graph on the left shows the growth of the staff over the past 7 years. And in fact, it's slightly misleading, as we probably have added 3 or 4 staff by the end of the fiscal year 15. And then the graph on the right shows the growth of the organization in terms of revenue over the same period, over the past 7 years. And I'll tell you what's remarkable about this fiscal year, and this is a little bit inside baseball, but we're going to end up finishing our fiscal year $5 million over budget in revenue. In other words, we will bring in $5 million more to TU to do more projects on the ground than we actually budgeted for in the beginning of the fiscal year. And there are a few reasons for that, and I'll tell you one of them. It's because that money flows to things that people want, and people want what we do at Trout Unlimited. We do very few things at TU, but the few things that we do better than anyone else. The second slide that may look familiar to many of you is this. This is a representation, it's not complete, but it's a representation of where we are working around the country. Each of these dots, in many cases, represent multiple projects where TU is on the ground. This is just the picture from the national view. This does not include, which I hope to be able to do in future years, all of the work that you are doing through your chapters and through your state councils. And what's noteworthy is that behind every dot, there are stories of dozens of people who are working together to protect and restore trout and salmon habitat. Dozens of people who have made a shared commitment to help sustain the health of the lands and waters that sustain this great nation. And so today, what I'd like to do is, rather than focus in a really deep dive on the places and the policies that we've been able to achieve over the past, or protect or restore over the past year, I'd like to talk more about the people that make that work possible. So if I could think of one person that I have come across in the organization that best embodies the mad farmer, it would be Fred Rasmussen from Colorado. Feel free to clap. So we talk a lot at Trout Unlimited about the need to diversify the organization and to get younger. And I want to be clear that this isn't a nod to us being politically correct. This is a matter of survival. If you look at the demographic trend in the country right now, if we don't get younger and more diverse, we will no longer be relevant as an organization. But that doesn't mean that we should ever forget that we stand on the shoulders of giants at Trout Unlimited. And Fred Rasmussen is one of those giants. Fred was a radio operator on a B-17 in World War II. He was shot down twice, once over Poland and once over Switzerland. You can probably do the math and figure out his age, but I will tell you this about Fred. This picture was taken with his son. I actually think that's a guide, not his son, but he was fishing with his son 3 weeks ago when he sent me this photograph. Fred has been a chapter president. He founded a chapter. He was a state council chair, and then he joined the national board of the organization. Fred's story is remarkably similar to dozens of yours as I look out across this audience. So, do we need to get and want to get younger and more diverse? Absolutely. But we will do that by honoring the contributions of people like Fred, who have made Trout Unlimited the great organization that it is today. We talked a little bit about this yesterday in some of our meetings, but since 2010, we have trained over 750 volunteers in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia to do monitoring on over 330 sites. Barb St. John, who's pictured in the inset down below, leads a team of about 17 people who are monitoring 55 sites across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They are on the front edge of something that we call citizen science or angler science. We have such tremendous potential in this organization to tap into the passion of our grassroots and to provide them with the tools and technology to create an environmental baseline against which we can measure change over time. Now, we talk a lot about Trout Unlimited, how we're not opposed to energy development. We're not opposed to shale gas development. We just want to see it done right. Well, thanks to the contributions of Barb and hundreds of others like her, we now actually have the tools to measure that change over time and to take corrective action if it's necessary. I've sometimes said in the past that TU is the patron saint of forgotten environmental causes, whether it's acid rain or cleaning up abandoned hard rock mines in the West or pushing for in-stream flow reform in the West and in the East. These are difficult issues. These are not issues that lend themselves to charismatic megafauna, but they are incredibly important. And so it is with acid mine drainage. For the past 15 years, Pam Milovic, retired from the Department of Environmental Protection, Butch Davey from the Bureau of Forestry, and Amy Wolf have soldiered on in Kettle Creek, to the point that now a river system that was once dead breathes again and lives again. And a great example of that is on 2 Mile Run. We now have 6 miles of connected habitat that were previously void of fish that now have brook trout in every age class because of their work. And when you ask them what the secret to their success was, invariably the three of them will point to the other, demonstrating the old adage that there is no end to the amount of good that you can do if you're willing to give credit to others. Now, I share this story because we like to play to the home team here at Trout Unlimited. But the fact is I could have told the exact same story about our work on the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia and how we've worked there with the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service to extend the range of brook trout off the mountains of the Monongahela. I could tell the same thing over on the West Coast in California, where we're working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to help recover Lahontan cutthroat trout. This idea of working in partnership with our state and federal agencies is a core aspect of TU's brand of collaborative stewardship. Working with volunteers can sometimes be challenging. I thought about that, and it's challenging not just from the staff to the volunteer, but from the volunteer to the volunteer and back again. And I thought about that as I as I read a poem that Wendell Berry calls The Contrariness of the Mad Farmer. He says, I am done with apologies. If contrariness is my inheritance and destiny, so be it. If it is my mission to go in at exits and come out at entrances, so be it. If I have been caught so often laughing at funerals, that was because I knew the dead were already slipping away, preparing a comeback. And can I help it? When they said, I know that my Redeemer liveth, I told them, he's dead. And when they told me God is dead, I answered, he goes fishing every day in the Kentucky River. I see him often. When they asked me if I would like to contribute, I said no, and when they had collected more than they needed, I gave them as much as I had. When they asked me to join them, I wouldn't, and then went off by myself and did more than they ever would have asked. I was thinking about how irascible volunteers can be, and this is a true story, and I'm going to fudge it just a little bit because the protagonist is actually in the audience today. A number of years ago, I sent out a note to a bunch of our employees and volunteer leaders celebrating the fact that a number of staff had recently given birth to children. And I immediately that evening got a note back from this unnamed party taking me to task for focusing on such a trivial issue when they were busy fighting a hostile state legislature. And I remember thinking, I'm talking about the birth of children here. But as irascible as working with volunteers can be, the fact is that they are the heart and soul of this organization. You are all the secret sauce that make us as powerful and effective as we are. And so it is with John Braco, our grassroots trustee from New York State. John has been intimately involved in helping the state of New York better respond to floods. Now, all of you are familiar, particularly those of you who are from this area, with the tremendous storms that we had with Hurricane Irene and Sandy and Tropical Storm Isabel. But the fact is that the damage to streams doesn't typically come, not the long-lasting damage, from the storm itself. It comes from the response to the storm. It comes from when states and local communities immediately respond by dropping the bulldozers into the stream bed and straightening it out and channelizing it and ditching it and berming it and otherwise ruining fish habitat and otherwise exacerbating flooding for downstream communities. This happens it has happened across the Northeast and New England states. It's not unique to New York. Well, in the aftermath of Tropical Storm Isabella, the state of New York spent $5 million to channel and ditch Little Schoharie Creek, and you can see what the effects were. They're now going to spend, through John's patient advocacy, an additional $12 million to put this stream back together again. But the important thing is that I think we and the state and other states that we have been working with have learned a valuable lesson in terms of how to more sensibly and responsibly respond to these floods that we know are going to continue and probably continue to get worse. Another great example of the persistence of volunteers paying off can be found in the Great Smoky Mountains. Charlie Shimoleski has been working with his local chapter for 25 years in the Smokies, doing stream monitoring. And this past year, he worked with our great partners at the Park Service, Steve Moore and Matt Culp, on a project called Lynn Camp Prong. And Charlie and a group of volunteers went into the park and they did fish shocking and stream monitoring and fish reintroduction. And as a result, in 2015, when that 8.5 miles of Camp Lynn Prong reopened for fishing, it marked the first time since 1934 that every stream in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park was open and available for public fishing. This year, our science team released the inaugural State of the Trout report. This is the single most comprehensive assessment of the status and trend of native trout in the United States. And its findings are sobering. 3 of our 28 native trout species that existed here historically have been extirpated. Half of those that remain occupy 1/4 or less of their historic habitat. But in spite of those grim findings, the report is chock full of examples of how resilient these fish are and how if you give them half a chance, they will respond and they will come back. Now, our science team, they are not rocket scientists themselves, but they do work with them. Pictured above is, in the inset, is a man named Seth Wengner. He's actually a former TU scientist who went on to work at the faculty of the University of Georgia. We are partnering with the University of Georgia and NASA to use satellite imagery to better understand the habitat needs of trout across broad landscapes. This will be an invaluable tool to helping to better understand the scope and the scale at which we need to take restoration to help bring these fish back. And it's another great example of how our science team is helping to set the agenda for restoration and recovery of trout and salmon across the United States. That's a good-looking crew, isn't it? Carol Evans has been working on Maggie Creek in northern Nevada for 20 years. She's with the Bureau of Land Management. And she's assembled a great partnership of mining companies, livestock operators, and TU chapters to help recover Lahontan cutthroat trout. And after 20 years, that group have been able to recover 82 miles of Lahontan cutthroat trout, including 28 miles of interconnected habitat that Lahontans can now move through. It's probably one of the largest connected habitats that fish has. And if you want to see what restoration on Maggie Creek looks like, take a look at this picture. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. 82 miles of that sounds pretty good to me. Conservation is about people helping people to help the land. For a decade now, we have been trying to pass in-stream flow legislation in the state of Wyoming without success. This year, however, two of our staff, Corey Toy and Nick Walrath, worked with a group of landowners on the in the Upper Green River, and they basically took 2,000 acres that would have otherwise been irrigated for hay out of production, and the landowners were allowed to leave that water in stream to benefit fish during the low flow periods of July through September. Now, the man in the middle is named Freddie Boater. He owns this ranch, and it extends from the flanks of the Wyoming range all the way down to the Green River. I had the pleasure of meeting him earlier this summer. He owns a massive operation. And when Freddie was asked why he did this work, this is what he had to say. He said, "For me, it's not just about profit or how many cattle you own. It's about values, real-life values, for sustaining the resources of these incredible lands, these pristine waters, for family, for country, for generations to come." Now, eventually, we will get in-stream flow legislation passed in Wyoming and in other states. And the reason we will do so is because of the relationships that we build with people such as Freddie Boater. I'm fairly confident that this is violating several of the keep 'em wet principles. But this is Brian Moran. He's a combat veteran who, when he came to us, said that his scars were on the inside. And Brian and his spouse were part of a group of people that we took out to Montana this summer, a group of veterans that we took out to Montana this summer to go fishing. And they had an incredible time, in large part because of the fellowship that the Montana Council and chapters and all the volunteers who helped these veterans supplied. And here's what Brian had to say when he finished that trip. He said, "The common ground was a river in Montana with at times swift current and slippery rocks, a lot like life. I have become your biggest convert to the religion of fishing, and I am spreading the good word. My best friend and last commander suffers from a traumatic brain injury. I will be teaching him to fly fish. I even chose the TU chapter closer to my brother, a retired U.S. Air Force pilot, so we can join together." Over 150 chapters served over 2,800 veterans this year and provided that kind of healing. So I first met Michael Chilton this year at the Upper Midwest Regional Meeting. We were doing a round robin of introductions, as we invariably do. And Michael said, "You know, I'm just a guy who is trying to do some good and have some fun." And boy, did he ever. So he was the president of a chapter that it had been dormant for a while. And he knew that there was very little appetite to do a large banquet. And so he decided to do something smaller scale and to just try to make it fun and easy. And he went out and he got a local winery to donate their space and drinks. and he went to a local cheese shop and got them to donate finger foods. He had a showing of Heart of the Driftless. He kept the ticket prices very low, and he had a smashing turnout. So I actually think Derek Edwards is in the room today. Derek, where are you? There he is over there. So Derek is a junior at West Virginia University, and he didn't grow up fly fishing, but one day he saw something in the paper about the Forbes Trail chapter having a chapter meeting, and he asked his father to take him to the meeting. And the rest is history. Derek got swept up in TU's stream of engagement, first by involving with chapter activities. Then he attended 2 of Pennsylvania's fantastic youth and conservation camps before finally attending one of our teen summits. And upon graduating high school, he went to WVU and he started their 5 Rivers Club. The 5 Rivers Club at WVU has emphasized taking disabled kids, getting disabled kids out on the water and fishing with them. And they also have planned a host of conservation activities in conjunction with their local chapter and other partners. So this is called a photarium. I just learned this word yesterday from Jack Williams. But this is an important part of our citizen science angler effort called Trout Blitz, where we're encouraging anglers to safely photograph fish when they catch them. And the person holding the photarium is a man named Derek Young. Derek is the owner of the Emerging Rivers Guide Service in Yakima, Washington. He's been a long-time TU business member and a strong supporter of the Washington Council. But Derek felt as though he were a person without a chapter. And that's totally understandable. Most states aren't like Pennsylvania, where it seems that you all have a chapter practically for every watershed in the state. But in states like Washington State, you've got chapters with these broad geographic sweeps, and it's easy to feel disconnected from them. So Derek did something about it. He gathered a group of people, and he decided to form a new chapter. It's the Yakima River Headwater chapter. This chapter demonstrated in an incredibly short period of time what a vibrant and active chapter can do. They set about making their goal protecting the headwaters of the Yakima. They had stream restoration projects set up. They had fun fishing outings. They had events that emphasized taking women fishing, introducing them to fly fishing together. They got heavily involved in youth education. They're now one of the more vibrant chapters in the Pacific Northwest and a great example of chapter leadership by one person helping to pull together a great cause. And I'll tell you, I have seen their Headwaters Matter bumper sticker as far away as New York. I first met Hayley Powell when she came to Washington, D.C. to meet with Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell. You can see the photo down in the bottom right with the Washington Monument behind them. Hayley had won a writing contest on the value of public lands and came back to Washington. But before that, she had been, for a long time, someone who loved to tie flies. She was passionate about fly tying, and it was something she did largely to bond with her father. She didn't really get into fishing until later. But eventually her parents took her to a local chapter meeting. She got on the board of the chapter, and then the Wyoming Council very wisely made her the youth education and outreach director for the state council. Sadly, Hayley's father passed away, and Hayley rededicated herself to her Trout Unlimited family, and in particular, protecting a place called Little Mountain, where we have an active campaign going, and frankly, more importantly, was a place that she loved to fish with her dad. Today, she's a college student at the University of Wyoming, and rather than follow the path of creating a 5 Rivers chapter, she decided to join the chapter that was extant there, and she's already serving on their board. Now, I thought about Hayley and Michael and Derek, and frankly, many of you in the audience today, when I read this poem called "The Mad Farmer Stands Up in Kentucky for What He Thinks is Right." There he is crawling, stomach and elbows across the frozen field, apples in his pockets, binoculars tucked in his coveralls. The mad farmer is a writer, teacher, naturalist, and family man. He rests in his trek and eats an apple, shakes his fist at the weekend warriors practicing bombs on the countryside. The mad farmer drives a Scout, wears galoshes and a cap, with ears that tie under his chin. He gets the headache when he goes to town twice a week to teach. Cincinnati money has bought the next farm for 100-foot riverfront lots. The mad farmer is under attack also by friends and family for being a communist, a reactionary, a liberal, a revolutionary, a patriot, a cop-out, and a dangerous influence on the youth. He makes it finally to the knoll, and sure enough, there they are, wood ducks on the slough. There are dozens of wood ducks on the slough. Like the mad farmer, our connection to the places that we fish is real and deep. We don't do this work because we should. We do it because it's a core part of who we are as people. We do it because we must. So Ty Churchwell in the Five Rivers chapter in Colorado did something extraordinary this past year. They actually convinced Congress to pass a bill. Their Hermosa Creek Watershed Protection Act permanently protects over 100,000 acres of public lands. These are public lands that you own as a birthright of being a U.S. citizen. And you should now rest easy knowing that 100,000 acres of your land will now be permanently protected forever for you and your children to enjoy because of the work of Ty and several members of the Five Rivers chapter. Now, I'll tell you, this wasn't an easy process. There's a group called the Hermosa Creek Working Group. And behind every one of these successes that we celebrate in this organization, there's typically a process like this, where disputing parties have to come together and get together and work out issues. And I'll tell you, the meetings that they had over a several-year period, they weren't easy. There were a lot of times when tempers flared. But along the way, a remarkable thing happened. These former antagonists began to understand and actually listen to their opponents' views. Meals were shared, friendships developed, and ultimately they came up with a plan that was so stable and so strongly supported that the Colorado delegation, even though Congress is not in the business of passing laws any longer, the Colorado delegation had to pass this bill. Now, what's so cool about this is that it's not unique. This is how TU represents. This is who we are. This is how we operate, right? This is what we do. And it is the Hermosa Creek example, and it's one of dozens that I could cite across the organization. But it is a perfect illustration of how Theodore Roosevelt defined conservation as being the application of common sense let's see if I can get this right, the application of common sense to common problems for the common good. Now I think every time I've done this talk, I've talked about Bristol Bay. And I must admit that the only reason I know anything about Bristol Bay and the Kvichak River is because of this man, Brian Kraft. Brian Kraft owns the Alaska Sportsman's Lodge on the Kvichak River in Alaska. He has been a tireless advocate for protecting Bristol Bay from what would be one of the world's largest industrial scale mines. He has flown dozens of people over the mine site to let folks understand what a bad place this would be to build an open pit gold mine. He's taken hundreds of people out on the river to show them the remarkable resource that is the Kvichak and the Nushagak and the surrounding rivers in the Bristol Bay region. And he's flown back to Washington, D.C. to testify in support of protecting this incredible treasure of a place. What makes the Bristol Bay campaign so unique, though, is that how bottom-up it is. Most of the conservation in the history of the state of Alaska has been foisted on the state by the U.S. Congress. That's just a fact. But that's not the case with the Bristol Bay campaign. If you go out into these local native villages and you poll the people there, and you have to remember that this is a landscape that's the size of Ohio with just a few thousand people living in it. But when you go to these remote villages, you find 80 to 85% support for not allowing large-scale industrial mining in that region. And the reason for that is that people like Nancy Morris Lyne, shown up here on the left, did smart things like creating a Bristol Bay Guides Academy. So Nancy went out and with other lodge owners in the area, and they've gathered young people, and they're teaching them how to tie flies, how to tie knots, how to be an effective guide. And more than a dozen of those young people are now employed in the Bristol Bay region. Remember how small this region is. And I'll tell you why that's important, because those young people will be among the most fearsome and tireless advocates for Bristol Bay, because that conservation, which is most local, is most durable. I'm going to finish up with one of my favorite stories of TU in action. So we have succeeded in restoring protections for small streams in 37 states. Unfortunately, there was a recent injunction that is prohibiting the Clean Water Act rule from being applied in 13 states. But I'm very confident that we will overcome that. And the reason we will overcome it is because this is an example where every aspect of Trout Unlimited, and I mean every aspect, pulled in the same direction. From the national board, where we had 20 at-large trustees meet with multiple members of Congress, many of whom they were probably supporting financially, to help them understand that small streams matter, all the way down to the grassroots, or I should say up to the grassroots, so as not to offend. Where people like Jeff Ripple from Pennsylvania came back and met with his member of Congress and his staff and put on an absolute clinic about why intermittent and ephemeral streams matter and why the protections of the Clean Water Act that existed for the first 30 years of the law's implementation should apply to those small headwater streams. And then he went back home and he wrote and published in his local newspaper an op-ed that made the point to other anglers that you need to make your voices heard. You need to get involved in this fight. And I'd be completely remiss not to mention my skinny-legged friend over there on the right with the spinning rod and the oh-so-small bass in his hand. But this is the best fish picture that Steve Moyer has after 20 years of working at Trout Unlimited. So Steve, in his own quiet, self-effacing, never-take-credit way, is the reason that we are where we are today on this issue. Steve has held this coalition together through thick and through thin. When some of us couldn't understand exactly what the issues were, Steve would patiently explain it. He's been a tireless advocate on Capitol Hill, and because of his leadership, I am extremely confident that we will ultimately see the protections of the Clean Water Act once again apply to small headwater streams as they did for the first 30 years of the Clean Water Act's existence. So I want to share one final poem here. I told Christensen I was going to come up here and read poetry to you all, and he said, well, good luck with that, bud. This is called Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front. So friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Invest in the millennium, plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. Say that when the leaves are harvested, say that the leaves are harvested when they have rotted into the mold. Call that profit. Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection. So that is some heady stuff, right? Practice resurrection. But make no mistake about it. You practice resurrection every time you support Trout Unlimited. You practice resurrection every time you go out and work to restore a degraded river. You practice resurrection every time you take a child out of doors and let them learn and explore and understand the wonder of nature. And you practice resurrection every time you help a veteran to find solace on the water or to find community in a chapter. Practice resurrection. Thank you all very much. Thank you.